She had one piece of bread left in the world. No pack, no name that anyone in this part of the road would recognize with any kindness. No wolf, just the rejection brand pressed into the skin of her collarbone, still raw enough that the fabric of her shirt felt like sandpaper against it every time she breathed. She had been walking for 3 days, and the road had not gotten kinder, and neither had she. Sierra Conti sat at the edge of a collapsed stone bridge, feet dangling over the dry creek bed below, and held the bread in both hands the way you hold something when you know it is the last of a thing. She was not counting it the way you count money. She was just holding it, feeling the weight of it, the specific smallness of one piece of bread when it is all you have, and you are trying to decide if you are angry enough to keep going. She was deciding she probably was not when she heard the breathing. It was coming from below the bridge, from the shadow under the far abutment where the stone had crumbled and left a kind of ledge. Controlled breathing, too controlled, the kind a person does when they are in real pain and they do not want anyone to know it. She knew that breathing. She had been doing it herself for 3 days. She climbed down without thinking much about it, which was a habit she had, the not thinking, the just moving toward the thing that needed moving toward. Her boots hit the dry creek bed, and she walked around the base of the abutment and found him there. He was sitting with his back against the stone, and his knees drawn up and one hand pressed flat against his ribs, and he was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has been caught doing something he considers private. The something in this case was bleeding. The gash along his left side had soaked through the cloth he had packed against it. His travelling clothes were plain, worn at the elbows, the kind of clothes a man wears when he does not want to be noticed. He had no pack mark on his neck, no insignia anywhere she could see, dark eyes, jaw tight, breathing carefully and evenly and not once asking her for a single thing. She recognized that performance down to the bone. She had been running it for 3 days, probably longer if she was being honest. She crouched down to his level and looked at the wound. He let her look, which told her he was in more trouble than his face was admitting to. The cut was deep enough to need cleaning. He had done what he could with what he had, which was not enough, but it was competent. He was not helpless. He was simply out of resources. She understood that distinction personally. "How long?" she asked. "Yesterday morning," he said. His voice was low and even and careful, not weak, just rationed the way all things were when you were not sure how much you had left. She looked at his face. He was watching her with the same assessment she was running on him. 2 people with nothing to offer trying to figure out if the other one was a threat. She decided he was not. She did not know how she knew. She had always been better at reading people than she was at reading her own situation, which was, she acknowledged, not a particularly useful imbalance. She straightened up and held out the bread. He looked at it, he looked at her, he did not reach for it. "I am not taking your last piece of bread," he said. "I did not ask what you were or were not taking," she said. "I am giving it to you. You do not know me. I know you have been sitting here since yesterday morning pressing your hand against that wound and breathing like it costs you something," she said. "That is enough." He looked at her for another moment. She kept her hand out. She was aware in a distant and unsentimental way that she was giving away the last thing she had, and she found that she could not locate the version of herself that would make a different choice. That person did not seem to exist. Maybe she never had. He took the bread. He did not eat it immediately. He held it the same way she had been holding it, and something in that specific detail, the way he understood the weight of it, made her chest do something she did not have a word for. She tore a strip from the hem of her undershirt and used it to repack the wound properly. He held still and let her work, and she worked the way she always had, quiet and efficient and completely focused, because healing was the one thing in her life that had always felt like solid ground. She had been the healer for Ironville Pack for 4 years. She had trained under the Pack elder at 16 and taken over the role at 19, and done it with everything she had for every single one of those years. She had healed Marco Ferry's people when they were injured and sick and afraid. She had sat with the ones who were dying and made sure they did not die alone. 5 days ago, Marco had stood in the center of the gathering circle and read the rejection decree in front of the whole pack. Unfit, insufficient, released. He had not looked sorry. That was the part she kept coming back to. She could have handled sorry. She had no idea what to do with the specific expression of a man who had just put down something that was inconveniencing him and felt lighter for it. The pack elder had pressed the brand to her collarbone with the iron heated in ceremony fire, and Sierra had stood perfectly still, because she was not going to give 60 people the satisfaction of watching her face change. She had walked the mile marker before she let herself feel any of it. She tied off the bandaging now and sat back on her heels and looked at her work. Clean, it would hold. "You have done that before," the man said, not a question. "I was a pack healer," she said. "I am not anymore." He looked at the brand on her collarbone, visible above her collar. She did not pull the fabric up to cover it. She had tried that for the first day. It was too exhausting. The brand was there. People were going to see it. She had decided she was not going to spend her energy managing their reaction to it. "I am sorry," he said. "Don't be," she said. "It is not your fault." "That is not actually why people say they are sorry," he said. "They say it because something happened to you that should not have happened. The fault is a separate matter." She looked at him. That was a precise and honest thing to say, and in her current experience, precise, honest things were rare enough to be notable. He ate the bread. She watched the creek bed and thought about nothing in particular, which was easier than thinking about something. "You're named," he said. "Sierra Conti." He nodded once. He did not offer his own name, and she noted the omission but did not press it. People had reasons for the things they withheld. She was not in a position to judge that. She stood and picked up her coat from the ground where she had set it and prepared to leave, because there was nothing left to do here, and the road did not stop being a road just because she was tired of walking it. "You are walking the wrong direction," he said quietly, "if you want to stay out of Ferry's reach." She stopped. The creek bed was very still around them. Somewhere above on the road a cart went past, the wheels loud on the broken stone. She turned around slowly. He was watching her with those dark, careful eyes, and he knew Marco Ferry's name. He had said it the way you say a name you have been carrying in a file, not the way you say the name of someone you met once. He knew her pack. He knew her alpha. He had known, from the moment she climbed down into this creek bed, exactly who she was. And he had waited. He had not used it to take anything from her. He had waited until she was leaving, and then he had said it like an offering, like information she was owed rather than leverage he possessed. She stood at the edge of the shadow the bridge cast across the dry creek bed, and she looked at this man with no name and no pack mark and a wound he had been sitting with since yesterday morning, and she felt something shift in the air between them. Not threat, something else entirely, something that felt almost like the specific gravity of a moment that is about to change the shape of everything that comes after it. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Someone who would very much like to stand up if you are willing to help me, and then I will answer every question you have." She crossed back to him and put out her hand, and he took it, and she pulled him to his feet, and neither of them said anything else for a moment because some things do not need words right away. The road above them was still going wherever roads went. The bread was gone, the brand on her collarbone still burned. But she was not, she realized, deciding any more whether she was angry enough to keep going. She already knew the answer. She had known it since she climbed down into this creek bed toward a stranger's careful breathing, because that was who she was, and no rejection decree in the world had managed to change it. She was angry enough. She had always been angry enough. She just had not known until this moment that it was going to matter. 4 days after the bridge, Sierra stood in a room that cost more than everything she had ever owned. She did not say that out loud. She was getting better at not saying the things she was thinking, which was a skill she suspected she was going to need inside these walls. The room had a window that looked out over the capitals in a courtyard, an actual bed with an actual frame, and a wash basin with clean water that someone had filled that morning without being asked. She had stood at that basin for a long time when she first arrived, just looking at it. Something about clean water being simply there, waiting, no effort required, made her feel something she did not have a clean name for. She had been officially brought in as a witness. That was the word Luca had used when he explained it to his people at the gate, calm and authoritative, a man accustomed to being the last word in any room. Witness. She had not argued with the word. She did not yet know what other word would fit better. What she knew was this: Luca Rinaldi was the Alpha King. She had worked that out before he told her, somewhere on the second day of travelling north, when she had noticed the way every person they encountered on the road found reasons to look away, and the way he moved through space like someone who had never once in his life been required to make himself smaller. She had filed the observation away and waited, because pressing was not her nature, and because whatever he was carrying, he would tell her when he was ready. He had told her on the third evening plainly, sitting across a small fire with his wound freshly rebandaged and his eyes steady on her face. Alpha King, travelling in secret, an investigation he had not yet explained fully. She had listened without interrupting, which she was good at, and when he finished she had said practically that she supposed that explained why he knew Marco Ferry's name. He had said yes. That was all. Neither of them had made it larger than it needed to be in that moment, and she had appreciated that more than she could say. Now she was in the capital, and the investigation was about to explain itself, and she was standing in this expensive room trying to feel steady inside her own body. She had been a pack healer for 4 years. She knew how to walk into a room where someone was suffering and make herself useful. She did not know how to walk into a king's capital as anything other than a rejected Omega with a brand on her collarbone and no clear reason for being trusted. Those were 2 very different kinds of entering a room, and she was working out which one applied here. A knock at the door, she said, "Come in." It was not Luca. It was an older man, compact and precise, with sharp eyes behind small glasses and the hands of someone who had spent decades doing careful work with them. He introduced himself as Dr. Armando Esposito, the king's royal physician, and he asked her, with the direct courtesy of a man who did not waste words, if she would come to his workroom. The king was already there. There was something they needed to show her. She followed him through corridors that were older than anything she had grown up around, stone worn smooth by generations of feet, and into a workroom that smelled like the inside of her own mind. Dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, glass bottles arranged by size along one wall, the particular sharp, clean smell of a space where serious work happened. She felt something loosen in her chest the moment she walked in, which was information she filed quietly away. Luca was standing at the far table. He looked at her when she came in, and whatever he saw in her face when she took in the room made something shift briefly at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly, the shadow of one. Esposito moved to the table and uncovered a small glass dish containing a residue she did not immediately recognize. Dark, crystalline at the edges, with a faint color to it that was almost amber. "This came from the bandaging," Esposito said. He was looking at her steadily. "From the cloth you used at the bridge. I took a sample when the king arrived and submitted your field dressing for analysis. I want to be clear that I did this because the compound it contained is one I have been trying to identify for 2 years, not because of anything you did wrong." She looked at the residue. She looked at Esposito. She said, "What compound?" He told her. It took him several minutes to explain it fully, and she listened the way she listened to everything, completely and without interruption. The compound was rare, old formulation, older than the current crown's records on it. It was a poison, slow-acting, designed to metabolize in a wolf system over weeks rather than days, which made it nearly impossible to trace as a cause of death. 3 regional pack leaders had died in the past 8 months. All of them had shown the same late-stage presentation. Esposito had been unable to isolate the compound from the body evidence alone because it degraded too fast after death. The residue in her bandaging was fresh. It had not degraded. It was the clearest sample he had ever had. She processed this for a moment, then she said, "How did it get into my bandaging?" Esposito and Luca exchanged a look. It was the look of 2 people who had already had part of this conversation and were now arriving at the part they had been waiting to have with her. "You handled it," Esposito said. "Before the bread, before the bridge. The compound responds to contact with a specific bloodline's touch. It becomes temporarily inert, unable to degrade, which is why it preserved in the cloth." He paused. "The bloodline is called the Conti Healer line." The workroom was very quiet. "That is my name," she said. "Yes," Esposito said. She looked at the glass dish on the table. She looked at her own hands. They looked exactly the same as they always had. She did not know what she had expected. Some visible difference. Some explanation written on her skin. There was nothing. Just her hands, the same hands that had packed wound dressings and brewed fever tinctures and held the wrists of dying people so they would know someone was there. "The Conti Healer line," Luca said, and his voice was careful in the way she had learned meant he was giving her something real rather than something managed, "was believed extinct. The Crown Archive lists the last confirmed Conti Healer as having died 41 years ago. My family died of illness," she said. "That is what I was told when I was 6. a sickness that moved through the pack they were attached to. Esposito opened a second folder on the table and turned it toward her. Crown Archive records, death certificates, all of them, 12 names over a span of 9 years. She looked at the names and recognized 3 of them from the stories her grandmother had told her before her grandmother too was gone. Each death was recorded as natural. Each one had an attending physician listed in the margin. The same name on every record. Adriana Valenti. She is your chief counsel, Sarah said. She was not asking. She has been on the Royal Council for 19 years, Luca said. He said it the way you say a thing that you have been holding in your mouth for a while, and it does not taste any better for the holding. Sarah looked at the records, 12 people, her people, each death attended by the same woman who now sat at the right hand of the king who was standing across this table from her. She thought about Marco Ferri standing in the gathering circle, the specific expression on his face, not anger, not even contempt, just the look of a man who had been told to do something and was doing it. Marco did not decide to expel me on his own, she said. It was not a question either. She could see the shape of it now, the whole thing at once, the way you could sometimes see the full pattern of an illness once you had the right piece of evidence in hand. Marco was not the kind of man who made large decisions independently. He managed, he followed, he accepted arrangements that benefited him and asked few questions about the cost to others. Adriana has been using low-ranking alphas as intermediaries across 12 territories, Luca said. Ferry is one of 14 pack leaders who had formal contact with her network. Your expulsion order came from her directly. His name was on the decree, but the instruction came from above him. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the week before her expulsion. The pack leader from the Southern Territory who had come to Ironville on trade business and collapsed in the gathering hall. She had been called to treat him. She had worked for 2 hours trying to stabilize him. She had not been able to save him, but she had touched him, and she had used her hands the way she always used her hands, and she had known something was wrong in his blood that she did not have language for. She had mentioned it to Marco afterward. She had said the illness felt unusual, like nothing she had treated before. She had said she wanted to send a report to the Regional Healers Authority. 3 days later, Marco had called the gathering circle. She had thought for 5 days on the road that she had been expelled for being insufficient, for being the kind of healer who could not save a patient and did not know why. She had carried that specific failure like a stone in her chest the entire walk. That was not what had happened. She had been expelled because she had nearly identified the compound with her bare hands, and the woman running the network had needed her gone before she figured out what she was touching. She had been cast out not for her weakness. She had been cast out because of something in her that someone powerful was very afraid of. She put that thought down carefully, the way you put down something fragile, and looked at Luca. He was watching her face the way he had watched her face at the bridge, with full attention and no performance, just looking, just being honest about the fact that he was paying attention. There is one more thing, he said. He said it quietly, and the quiet of it told her it was the heaviest piece. He did not look at Esposito, he looked at her. My mother died when I was 9 years old, he said. The official record lists the cause as fever. She had been ill for 3 weeks. She had a personal physician throughout her illness who managed her treatment and kept the rest of the royal medical staff at a distance. He paused. I was told this was standard protocol for a member of the royal family, that the isolation was for her protection. Sarah did not say anything. She already knew the name she was about to hear. Adriana Valenti was her physician, Luca said. The workroom held that sentence for a moment, just held it. Sarah thought about a 9-year-old boy being told his mother had died of fever. She thought about 19 years of that woman sitting at his council table, advising him, present at every significant decision, inside every wall he had. She thought about what it meant to grieve something and never know the real shape of the thing you were grieving. She thought about her own 6-year-old self being told her family had died of illness, and the way that story had lived inside her ever since, just a fact of her life, something that had happened before she was old enough to question it. They had both been told the same kind of lie, different words, same author. How long has she been in your council? Sarah asked. She already knew. She had just heard him say 19 years, but she asked it because she needed a moment, and asking a question was the most honest way she knew to take one. Longer than I have been king, Luca said. She nodded once. She looked down at the archive records on the table, at the 12 names, at the single name repeated in the margin. She looked at the residue in the glass dish, amber-edged and inert, preserved by something in her blood that she had not known was there. She thought about 4 years of healing, about every person she had helped and every person she had not been able to help, and the specific helplessness of treating an illness you cannot name. She thought about the compound in that dying pack leader's blood, and her hands on his wrist, and the thing she had felt but could not describe, and the report she had tried to file that had ended her life in Ironville. She had been that close, right there with her hands on the evidence, and she had not known what she was holding. She knew now. She looked up at Luca. He was still watching her, still giving her the full weight of his attention without asking her to perform being fine about any of it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. It was a healer's question, the first question you asked when you had finished assessing the situation and were ready to work. Not "what can I do," which implied limits, "what do you need," which left the answer open. Something moved across Luca's face at the question, something brief and real that she did not think he had entirely meant to show her. "Right now," he said, "I need you to understand the full picture. Everything else we work out from there." She looked at the records one more time. 12 names, 1 physician, a compound that had killed 3 pack leaders and a king's mother and had been invisible to everyone except, apparently, the hands of the last living heir of the line built to find it. She was not a castaway. She had never been a castaway. She had been a target who survived by accident, protected for 5 days on a road going nowhere, by nothing more than her own refusal to become the kind of person who walked past someone bleeding in a ditch. The bread had saved him. Her hands had preserved the evidence. Her expulsion had been an attempt to expose her in open territory where she could be quietly removed. Every piece of it had been designed to end with her gone. She was still here. She straightened up from the table and looked at Dr. Esposito, who was watching her with the careful attention of a man who had spent a lifetime assessing what people were made of. "I want to see everything you have on the compound," she said. "Every record, every analysis, every patient file you were able to obtain, all of it." Esposito looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the specific nod of a person recognizing something they had been waiting to see. "I will have it ready within the hour," he said. She turned back to the window. The courtyard below was ordinary and quiet, people moving through their ordinary afternoon, and the capital was just a city, stone and light, and the smell of something cooking somewhere nearby. And somewhere inside these same walls was a woman who had been patient for 19 years and did not yet know that the last piece she had tried to remove from the board was still standing. Sierra was going to make sure she found out. She was not supposed to be in the council chamber that morning. Esposito had asked her to stay in the workroom. He had said it gently, the way he said most things, with the precise courtesy of a man who understood that gentle did not mean weak. He had 3 more compound records he wanted her to review, and the morning council session was a formal proceeding, and her presence there had no official basis yet. She had said yes. She had meant it when she said it. But something in his morning report had not sat right. It was a small thing, a detail he had mentioned in passing, the kind of detail that slides by when you are focused on larger pieces. Councillor Benedetto Riva had sent a note the previous evening requesting that the morning session begin with refreshments served at the table rather than in the antechamber. A small change in routine. An old man's preference, Esposito had said. Riva was particular about his mornings. Sierra had nodded and gone back to the records. 10 minutes later, she had put the records down and stood up and walked toward the council chamber, because she was a healer, and healers did not ignore the feeling that something was wrong just because they could not yet name it. That feeling had a track record. She had learned to trust it even when she looked unreasonable for doing so. The chamber doors were open. The session had already begun. She stood at the far edge of the entrance, just inside the doorway, where the stone pillar gave her something to stand beside without being immediately visible. The room was long and high-ceilinged, the kind of room built to make everyone inside it feel the weight of what was decided there. The council members sat at the long table, 9 of them, with Luca at the head. Adriana Valenti sat 3 seats to his right. Sierra had seen Adriana once briefly, in a corridor the previous day, from a distance. She was a composed woman in her late 50s, silver-haired, with the specific stillness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of power. She did not look like a woman who had spent 19 years killing people carefully. She looked like a woman who had spent 19 years being indispensable, which Sarah understood now was exactly the point. The session was running through territorial reports, routine business, the kind of morning where nothing was supposed to happen. Councillor Reaver was at the far end of the table, an old man with white hair and the deliberate posture of someone who had been attending formal sessions for 30 years and considered his bearing a point of professional pride. He was holding his water glass. He had been reaching for it periodically throughout the session, small sips, the ordinary habit of an old man in a warm room. Sarah watched him take a sip. She watched his hand lower the glass back to the table. She watched the exact moment his breathing changed. It was subtle, the kind of change that only registered if you had spent years in rooms with people whose bodies were starting to fail them. A slight shallowing, a barely visible tension in the muscles of his neck. His eyes stayed focused on the speaker across the table, and his face stayed composed, because Benedetto Riva was a man of 30 years of formal sessions, and he was not going to let his body alarm him in public if he could help it. But his breathing was wrong, and the water glass was sitting in front of him, and the refreshments had been served at the table this morning instead of the antechamber, and Adriana Valenti was 3 seats away watching the territorial report with calm, professional attention. Sarah was moving before the thought fully finished forming. She crossed the chamber floor at a pace that was not quite running, because running would have caused immediate disruption, and she needed 30 more seconds before disruption became necessary. She heard the shift in the room as people registered her entrance. She heard a voice, not Luca's, sharp and questioning, asking who she was and what she was doing. She did not stop. She reached Riva and put her hands on his shoulders, and felt it immediately. The compound was in his system. It had been there for less than an hour, which meant it was still moving, still spreading, not yet past the point where a body could be pulled back. She could feel it the same way she had felt the wrongness in the dying pack leader's blood at Ironville, that same wordless knowledge in her hands, except now she understood what she was feeling and she did not hesitate. She pressed her palms flat against the sides of his neck, where the blood moved closest to the surface, and she let her hands do the thing they had apparently always been able to do. She had no frame of reference for what it looked like from the outside. She only knew what it felt like from the inside, which was like reaching into deep water and finding the thing that did not belong there and pulling it toward the surface. It was not painless. It moved through her arms like cold fire, the compound responding to her blood the way Esposito had described, becoming inert on contact, losing its hold. She could feel Riva's body under her hands changing, the terrible shallow breathing beginning to deepen, the tension in his neck releasing by degrees. She was aware that the room had gone completely silent. She was aware that her hands were glowing. She had not known they would do that. The gold-white light was quiet, not dramatic, like the last of the sun coming through a window rather than anything she could have predicted or prepared for. It came from her palms and spread outward along Riva's shoulders and throat, and she watched it happen with the detached focus of a healer in the middle of a procedure, cataloguing what she was seeing because understanding it could come later and right now there was only the work. Riva drew a full breath, then another. His hand came up and covered one of hers, not pushing her away, just the instinctive reaching of a person who has been frightened and has found something solid. She stepped back when she was sure it had held. The chamber was still silent. 9 council members and their king, all of them looking at her, and the light fading slowly from her hands, and Benedetto Riva breathing normally at the end of the table with colour returning to his face. Then Adriana Valenti said, very calmly, "Restrain her." It was an impressive performance. Sarah would think about that later, the sheer composure of it. A woman whose plan had just been publicly dissolved, standing up from her chair and directing the room with the authority of 19 years of being the person people deferred to, naming Sarah as a threat before anyone in the room had time to process what they had just witnessed. 2 of the chamber guards moved. Sarah did not step back. "Wait," Luca's voice. The guards stopped. Luca was standing at the head of the table, and he was looking at Adriana with an expression that Sarah had not seen on his face before. Every other time she had seen him assess a situation, there had been something careful in it, something that weighed and measured before it landed. This was not that. This was a man who had just watched every piece of a 26-year-old question settle into its final answer, and the expression it produced was very quiet and very complete, and not the least bit uncertain. "Sit down, Adriana," he said. She did not sit down. She looked at him with the composed attention of a woman who had been managing this particular man since he was a grieving 9-year-old boy, and she said, "My king, the woman is an unregistered Omega who entered this chamber without authorization and touched a council member without consent. Protocol requires." "The compound in Councillor Reaver's water glass," Luca said, "is the same compound that killed 3 regional pack leaders, 2 territorial envoys and my mother." He said the last 2 words without any particular weight, which made them land with more weight than anything else in the sentence. "You have been the only consistent thread across every one of those deaths. I have had the records for 18 hours. I have been waiting to see what you would do this morning before I acted on them." The chamber absorbed this. Adriana looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that Sierra watched carefully because she was a healer and she read faces the way other people read text. It was not panic. It was not guilt exactly. It was the specific expression of a person who had run a very long and very patient plan and had finally reached the point where no adjustment remained available. A kind of release in it almost, the relief of a weight being put down. She sat down. Not because she was defeated, because there was nothing left to perform. The session dissolved into controlled chaos after that. Guards were called. Records were produced. Esposito appeared within minutes, which told Sierra he had been closer than his workroom, watching and waiting in the way of a man who had learned to be prepared. Reaver was examined and confirmed stable. The compound residue was collected from his water glass as evidence, clean and unambiguous, witnessed by 8 remaining council members and documented by the king's own recorder. Adriana said nothing through any of it. She sat in her chair with her hands folded on the table and watched the proceedings with the attention of a woman who had decided that silence was the last form of control available to her, and she was going to exercise it fully. Marco Ferri's written testimony arrived by courier 2 hours later. He had sent it the previous evening, Esposito explained, after receiving word through channels that the capital investigation had reached his name. He had not waited to be summoned. He had written it out in his own hand and dispatched it before Adriana could move to silence him, which meant he had understood, when the moment came, exactly what was happening to loose ends in her network. 12 pack leaders named. 19 years of operations, documented in the flat, specific language of a man, trading what he knew for whatever protection the truth might still buy him. The network collapsed in a single afternoon session. By evening it was over. Not quietly, not neatly. There would be months of tribunal proceedings and territorial restructuring, and a great deal of formal documentation that Sierra would hear about in pieces over the weeks that followed. But the central thing, the engine of it, the woman who had spent 19 years making herself indispensable while removing everyone who might one day recognize what she was doing, that was done. The council chamber emptied slowly. Guards remained at the doors. Esposito had taken Reaver to the medical suite, and the other council members had dispersed to whatever urgent conversations the afternoon demanded. The recorders had taken their documents and gone. Sierra sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, not at the table. The floor with her back against the stone wall below the window, knees drawn up, because it was where she thought best and she had several things to think about, and the floor was solid in a way that nothing else in the room currently was. Her hands had stopped glowing. They looked ordinary again in the evening light coming through the high windows. She turned them over and looked at her palms and thought about 4 years of pack healing and 12 names in an archive and a 9-year-old boy being told his mother had died of fever. She thought about a 6-year-old girl being told her family had died of illness. She thought about one piece of bread handed to a stranger in a dry creek bed because she could not locate the version of herself that would walk away, and how that single irrational act had somehow pulled the thread that unravelled all of it. She heard the chamber door. She did not look up. She knew the sound of his footsteps now, which was information she noted without comment. Luca crossed the chamber and sat down on the floor beside her. Not across from her. Not in one of the formal chairs that were sitting 10 feet away. Beside her, with his back against the same wall, the same way he had sat beside her by every fire for 4 days on a road going north, and she felt something in her chest settle at the specific familiarity of it. They sat in silence for a moment. The chamber was very quiet. Outside the high windows, the capital was doing whatever it did at the end of an ordinary day, which this had not been, but the city did not know that yet. "Reaver is going to be fine," Luca said. I know, she said. I could feel when it held. He nodded. He looked at his hands briefly, then at the chamber around them, then at her. I owe you an accounting, he said. You told me everything in the workroom. Not everything, he said. He said it the way he said things that cost him something, carefully without dressing it up. I knew what you were before Esposito confirmed the lineage. I suspected from the first night on the road, the way you worked, the way the wound responded to your hands. I had my mother's healer records, the ones Adriana had not destroyed, and the description of the Conti gift was in them. He paused. I brought you to the capital knowing more about what you were walking into than I told you. I made the same calculation I should not have made. The less you knew, I told myself, the more naturally you would move, the safer the approach. Sierra looked at him. He met her eyes and did not look away, which she had come to understand was his version of honesty in its most complete form. You could have told me, she said. Yes, he said, I should have. She thought about it. She thought about a woman who had spent 5 days on a road being told she was insufficient, who had walked into a capital as a witness with no clear footing, who had spent 2 days in a workroom rebuilding her understanding of her entire history. She thought about what it would have meant to have the full picture from the beginning, and she thought about whether having it would have changed any decision she actually made. She did not think it would have. She would have walked into that chamber anyway. She would have put her hands on Riva anyway. That was not the point. The point was that she had been carrying the weight of her own ignorance for 4 days, while he had been carrying the knowledge, and that was a specific kind of alone that she recognized, because she had been living some version of it for years. Don't do it again, she said. No, he said, I won't. She believed him. She did not know entirely why, except that she had been reading people for a long time, and he was one of the least dishonest people she had encountered, and his apologies arrived without decoration, which was how she knew they were real. The chamber held its quiet around them. What do you want? Luca asked. Not what did the crown require of her now, not what her lineage demanded or what the formal proceedings would need. What did she want? She looked at her hands again. The brand on her collarbone had stopped burning. She had not noticed exactly when it stopped, only that it had, sometime in the last hour, as though whatever had been locked beneath it had finally been given enough room. She wanted a workroom. She had known that since she walked into Esposito, and felt the smell of it go straight to the center of her chest. She wanted dried herbs and glass bottles, and the clean, specific smell of a space where careful work happened. She wanted the Conti healer records, whatever the archive still held, because there was an entire history of what she was that she had not been allowed to know, and she intended to know it. She wanted to rebuild the Royal Healing Authority properly, because Esposito had shown her the gaps in it, and they were significant, and people had been dying in those gaps. She wanted, though she was not ready to say this part out loud yet, to not be alone in the particular way she had been alone for most of her life. She wanted the thing she had felt sitting across fires for 4 days, the specific quality of being seen by someone who was paying real attention and not using what they saw to take anything from her. She said, I want a workroom, herbs, a window, time to learn what I actually am. Luca was quiet for a moment. You can have all of that. She looked at him. Are you staying? He asked. She had heard that question before from people who were asking whether she would be useful to them, whether she would be manageable, whether she would fit into the shape they needed her to fit into. It had never sounded like this. It sounded like a man asking a person plainly whether she was choosing to be here, not what the crown needed, not what her lineage required. Was she choosing this? Was she choosing him, without the crisis to justify it, without the road and the urgency and the compound and the archive pressing them together? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about one piece of bread. She thought about a stranger who had taken it with both hands and understood the weight of it. She thought about the whole long, improbable road from a dry creek bed to a council chamber floor, every step of which she had taken because she could not locate the version of herself that would have done otherwise. Hand me something to eat first, she said. I make better decisions when I am not starving. Something happened on his face. Not the corner of the mouth almost, not the shadow of a thing. The full version, real and unhurried, the kind of smile that had clearly not had many chances to exist unchecked, and it was, she decided, one of the better things she had seen in recent memory. He stood up and held out his hand. She took it and he pulled her to her feet, the same way she had pulled him to his feet at the bridge, and neither of them said anything about that symmetry, but she felt it and she knew he did too. They walked out of the council chamber together, and the evening was ordinary outside it, and somewhere in this capital there was a workroom with a window waiting for her, and the brand on her collarbone was quiet for the first time in 8 days, and she was hungry, and she was here, and she was staying. She had given away her last piece of bread to a stranger in a ditch because she was the kind of person who did that, because she had never been able to find the version of herself that wouldn't. It turned out that version of herself was the whole point. It had always been the whole point. She just had not known until now that the world was finally ready to agree with her,